Hi everybody. We're back for our third episode and our final episode of Mr. Lincoln's Way. So far in this book, we've learned about Mr. Lincoln, the principal, and Eugene, a student at Mr. Lincoln's school, who is showing some bullying behaviors and is making some sad choices in the way that he treats his classmates and schoolmates. Mr. Lincoln's worried about him, but instead of just writing him off like, oh, he's trouble, oh well, Mr. Lincoln tries to really get to know Eugene and find out what his gifts are. What does he know about? What kind of kid is he? How can I reach him? So this is really a story of love where this principal is reaching out to a student who really needs some attention and connection. So we left off with Mr. Lincoln and Eugene working on a school project. They're building, or they're improving their atrium, which is an open courtyard space in the center of a building. So in this case, they're planting trees and making birdhouses, and Mr. Lincoln found out that Eugene is an expert in understanding birds. So they've been working on this atrium together. And when we left off, it was just at the end of a conversation on this page where Eugene had treated two classmates poorly because of the color of their skin. And Mr. Lincoln was saying, you know, that we all have a gift to bring. Just like the birds in the atrium, all of them are different. And all of us together with all of our differences make a more beautiful world. So they just discovered that there are some nesting mallards in the, you can see them on this page, some nesting mallards in the atrium. So right before this happened, yes, so this is the spot where Mr. Lincoln asked Eugene to promise to treat people kindly. And then he says, no more teasing and name calling. Please promise me. And Eugene promised. Eugene was good to his word. He became a model citizen. He tried with all his heart to keep his promise to Mr. Lincoln. Then one bright morning, Eugene stopped at the atrium window. The eggs were starting to hatch. He ran from room to room and brought the whole school to watch. The ducklings were hatching one by one. At first, they were wet and unsteady, but in a short time, they were fuzzy and racing about. As the days passed, the mallard parents flew out of the atrium, landing on the pond just behind the school. They were leaving their babies for longer and longer periods of time. Eugene and Mr. Lincoln knew that the time was approaching when they would need to get the ducklings out of the atrium and into the pond. They had a plan. When the big day arrived, classes were asked to stay in their rooms. Then Eugene and Mr. Lincoln opened the door at the atrium and stepped in. They had both practiced saying ting ting like the mallard parents. Now they talked to the ducklings, coaxing them to follow. The father mallard waddled up the doorway of the atrium and peered down the hallway. At the end of the hall, the father mallard could see the lawn and the pool. Gling, gling, Eugene called. The mother mallard came out first, then one by one her babies followed. Eugene walked down the hall, calling them over and over as the family waddled behind him. Then, all at once, the mother and the father took the lead and the ducklings scurried after them. At the outside doorway, they stopped for a moment. Then the mother and father mallard jumped out of the doorway and coaxed each of their ducklings to follow. Mr. Lincoln and Eugene both stood and watched the ducklings race down the hillside and plopped into the pond with their parents. Now I know where the expression, like a duck takes to water, comes from, Mr. Lincoln laughed. He couldn't believe how well the babies swam. Parents had gathered at the top of the hill. They had been invited to watch from afar. Then Eugene heard a voice behind him that called out his name. "Eugene, boy, over here." It was his grandfather. The boy raced up the hill. Mr. Lincoln joined them both. "This is my grandpa," Eugene sang out. "I know," Mr. Lincoln said. Eugene turned toward him. Had Mr. Lincoln had something to do with this miracle, with his grandpa being here? Now the old man shook Mr. Lincoln's hand heartily. "I would sure like to stay with you again, Grandpa," Eugene said, as he and his grandfather walked up the hill together. The old man put his arm around the boy's shoulders. "We'll see, son. We'll sure see." Later, Eugene and Mr. Lincoln walked down by the pond together. Eugene needed to say something to Mr. Lincoln. "You showed those ducklings the way out, Eugene," Mr. Lincoln said. "Hey, you showed me the way out, Mr. Lincoln," Eugene smiled. Then he stopped and looked into his principal's eyes. "I'll make you proud of me, Mr. Lincoln. I promise." This is the most exciting part. Oftentimes, Patricia Polacco puts a little bit of an afterword or a postscript in her book. So this is what she says about what happens in the future. Eugene Esterhaus was true to his promise. He became a 4th grade teacher, and he called his students "my little birds." So that's a really beautiful book about love, and a lot of different kinds of love in this book. I'm wondering, as you think about central message, what you think the central message or messages in this book might be. This is the kind of thing I would love to have a discussion about, but I wish that you were sitting right in front of me. But I just wanted to give you a moment to think about that. What do you think the life lesson that Patricia Polacco is teaching in this book is? What is the moral of the story, the heart of the story? What's the little bit of wisdom? Those are the questions we ask ourselves when we're trying to identify a central message. For me, I see a few central messages in this book. I see that there's a message of not giving up on each other, where, Eugene was, full of bullying behaviors and causing a lot of hurt in his school, and people were really frustrated with him, teachers and principals and kids alike. And many of them might have just, written him off like he'll never change. But that's not what Mr. Lincoln did. Mr. Lincoln figured out a way to reach into his heart and figured out a way to show him a different way of living, right? Figured out a way to show him a different way, a model of being respectful to all. Before I read this book, I asked you the question, have you ever heard of or heard anyone say something bad about another group of people just because of who they are? Maybe because of the language they speak, or maybe because of the way their body works, or maybe because their family is different, or maybe because they go to a different church, or maybe because the color of their skin is different. And I'm going to ask you that question again to reflect on maybe a time when you heard others being put down or left out by something that just makes them themselves. And so with the example in this book, I'd like to invite you, the next time you hear of something like that, to interrupt that thinking, to decide that's not the story you're going to tell. One of the things I share with my students when they come across this kind of thinking or they hear this kind of hurtful speech is to respond back respectfully to the person who's speaking and say, that's a story that isn't true. You're telling a story that isn't true. You don't have to believe other people when they share their views about how some people are less than others. I think that's the most important central message. And I think there's also a real respect for nature and taking care of the birds. That was a strong theme as well. I hope you enjoyed Mr. Lincoln's Way. I hope you'll reflect on the central message and think about how to stand up for all of us. I'll leave it there, friends. We'll be back next week with another Patricia Polacco book.